Hi class, this is a brief transitional video, effectively between Unit 1 and Unit 2, and to kind of set the stage for what we'll be doing in the latter. Unit 2 is identified as with conceptual analysis, and obviously we're going to say a lot more about that, but I just want to first situate things based on what we already talked about in Unit 1, and then kind of foreshadow what will be in Unit 2, and then tie that in with the written assignment. So, in Unit 1, we learned about what philosophy is, why it might have value, and we've basically put one tool in our philosophical toolbox, that is argument and argument evaluation. So we know what an argument is, we know how to evaluate it in theory. But remember, some arguments you can know whether the premises are true or false just by appealing to the sciences, using Russell's definition. The other ones, though, the ones that I called philosophical arguments, you can't do that. And so imagine someone gave the following argument. This is not my argument, but it's one you've heard before. Abortion is murder. Murder is wrong. Therefore, abortion is wrong. It's a deductive argument from definition, first of all. How's its inference? Perfect. It's a valid argument, assuming it were true that abortion is murder, and assuming it were true that murder is wrong, would it follow that abortion is wrong? Well, of course. Is it sound? Well, let the screaming match commence. But roughly speaking, think of it this way. I know of no one who says abortion is murder, but it's fine. I've never heard anyone espouse that position. Probably not true, but close enough. And so what we really have to look at is the first premise. And notice just argument analysis alone doesn't really get us very far on this, whether we should accept premise 1 or not. And this is where we start to see the need for what I've been calling, what says on the syllabus, philosophical analysis, where we have to really dig in and carefully examine and identify and work with and delineate a concept such as murder. We all know what abortion is. That's not hard. That's a topic of biology. But what is murder is actually much, much, much harder because implicitly it has to determine what's a human, and whether a fetus is a human or not, or a fetus has human rights or not, is exactly what is at issue. And so this is an example of where we're going to need some philosophical analysis to figure out how we feel about this argument and or this position. But let me say a few things. Notice that we didn't, or I didn't say we need philosophical analysis for premise 2. Remember, premise 2 is murder is wrong. Well, yeah, technically right and wrong is a topic in philosophy, sure. But there's just not really intelligent disagreement about whether murder is wrong or not, at least in normal circumstances. And so this kind of tells us something important. Where we need philosophical analysis is the tricky cases and the borderline cases. And that's kind of what we're working with in the 3-part paper for the class. So take a concept like justice. Well, do I need a clear, careful definition of justice to know that Mickey simply assigning paper grades based on the person's last name is unjust? No, that's a clear case of injustice. Or by contrast, Mickey assigning paper grades based on desert, that is what they deserve, is a clear case of justice. We don't really need philosophical analysis to resolve those issues because our general, vague, working everyday definition of justice is sufficient for the task. But imagine instead something that's been talked a lot about lately, reparations. That's a much harder case because even though the people who have originally done the wrong are long gone, A, their effects are still harming people, and B, other people are still benefiting from it. And so that becomes a much harder case. And so what this is starting to tell us is where's philosophy going to be useful on these type of cases is on these type of cases where we have these tough disputes and these controversial topics that require us to get really clear on what makes a human in the sense of rights for abortion, for instance. Uh, what are the conditions for justice in the reparations discussion, etc. And this is a place where philosophy, well, these are places where philosophy can really, really help us. And so, first of all, the paper, there is an entire video on the paper, but just this is where it plugs in. Step one is just identifying that place, one of those places. Here's a topic that's controversial, and a way to help resolve that controversy is to get really, really, really clear on one of these philosophical topics that often are not clear. Um, this is what we're starting to work on. And Unit 2 is, we're going to be seeing that. So it might not be super obvious from the start, but a big part of Unit 2, we're going to read first the Crito, and that seems to be just what's going on with Socrates before his execution. But as we will see, his decision rests on an implicit conceptual analysis. Here's a controversial question. Do I have the right to escape prison and break the law if the law is clearly bad? Socrates was lawfully captured and lawfully sentenced to death. So the question is, am I obligated to follow a bad law? That's a controversial question, and it's a really interesting one. And it's one we still talk about today, and one I'd love to hear your thoughts on in the recitations. But we're going to have to get clear on some concepts in order to answer that question. And what we're going to have to get clear on in the Crito is, well, what are my duties to government and where do they come from? If I get really clear on that, that's not exactly a concept, but something like civic duty would be the relevant concept there. What do I owe to the government? If we get really clear on what is civic duty, that will tell me whether I'm obligated to follow a bad law or not. And so, despite the fact that the Crito is just the next one in the sequence after the Apology, there's really some philosophical analysis going on there. And it's pretty good stuff. After we do that, we're going to learn to formalize. We're going to do a little more logic, not argument, but still logic, to kind of help us do some of this heavy lifting in philosophical analysis. And then we're going to shift to the Euthyphro, which is Plato, not Socrates. And in the Euthyphro, they're going to try to just do a conceptual analysis on piety, that is pleasing to the gods. What should I be doing as a duty to powers of goodness, so to speak? And so we're definitely, and again, we're still approaching this at an introductory level, which is important because even though, so think of a concept like justice. That's something that philosophers have been worrying on and chewing on and refining for millennia, without exaggeration. And so, do I expect in an intro course for us to get a perfect concept of justice? No. But I would like us to at least get clear enough to settle the issue at hand. So, for instance, if I selected capital punishment for my paper, well, you should at least get clear enough on the concept of justice to know whether or not capital punishment is just. And so, working with these concepts, even if we can't get a completely perfect one, we're still gonna improve. We're gonna continue getting better, and with that improvement, that improvement isn't vacuous. The closer we get to the concept of justice, the more just a society we can have, etc. And so we can talk about progress without solution and still have value. Speaking of value, the last reading in the unit is just going to try to answer the question, what's the good life? That's important. That's something that if we could answer that, we could definitely have some good philosophical payoff. And so those are the three readings for the unit, tied with what we're trying to focus on. We're trying to put a second tool in our toolbox, philosophical analysis, which requires us to look closely at concepts, even concepts we already use every day, in order to resolve controversies. So, and by resolve, we should, since we're philosophers, we should mean find the truth of the matter. That's what we're really interested in philosophy, remember, is, well, is it true or not? And so we're not just espousing opinion here, we're trying to get at the genuine concepts. Maybe I've said enough, maybe I'm rambling a little now, but let me just give a couple more examples and places where this kind of concept is useful. There's kind of like a Hollywood meme joke about, well, philosophy is not really useful. First of all, if you ask what's the value of philosophy, you've asked a philosophical question, because only philosophy deals in value. Which means any controversial claim about value can be improved by philosophical analysis. So imagine, uh, think of big disputes in politics, whether we should lower taxes on corporations or not. Well, should, we're already implicitly assuming some sort of value. We're stepping outside of the sciences if we're talking shoulds. That's the discipline of philosophy. And so you might ask what kind of concepts would be required to figure out if we should implement a certain policy. Um, Something like the duty of government, what the government's supposed to be doing, is actually something people skip. The first step, talk about, and this is something we'll look at in Unit 3, what is the government's responsibility to its citizens? First, figure that out through clear, careful philosophical analysis, and then you could talk about the shoulds and should nots about tax reform. So this stuff does come up all the time, and we all already do it. So our job in philosophy then is to make us much better at doing it. Um, so these are topics that should improve your life, improve your thinking in some ways, because they are things that A, we do all the time, but B, we don't do very well. So just watch for that in everyday life, and if you want to post a discussion board, you can talk about some places where philosophical analysis should be used and maybe talk about how it could improve. And that's a good warm-up for finding a paper topic too. All right, next lecture, the Crido.